Well, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. When I was invited to come to the conference and speak today, two things made it really possible. I just came from Dubai, and so we're trying to work with the Abu Dhabi Department of Health and bring MDMA to the Arab world. And so this conference, I just arrived yesterday from Dubai, and the other part was my wife is off at a conference, so it was easier for me to be away. And I'd like to just start by thanking some people. Boaz Wachtel has come here, and over 25 years ago, he introduced me to Moshe Kotler, who was chief of psychiatry at Tel Aviv University, was the chief psychiatrist for the IDF, and Moshe Kotler, I'd been looking for years to try to find somebody in Israel that would be interested in trying to start psychedelic research in Israel, and Moshe Kotler was one. Boaz had been working with him to try to start ibogaine research, and that's now starting to come around after all this time. And also the SafeHeart people. I've always felt, and one of the things that's made it a bit more controversial, what we do, is that there's healing that comes from clinical context, from therapeutic context, but there's also healings that come from parties and from raves. And people tend to think, oh, the raves they're just for fun, they're not really for any kind of emotional work, they're just hedonistic, they're not really a healing context. One of our fundraisers who worked at MAPS was gay, and he said that during the 1980s, when people were dying of AIDS and they didn't have yet treatments for AIDS, that they worked through their grief with ecstasy on the dance floor. And when I was 18 years old and 17 and 18, I went to a college in Florida, an experimental college. This is 1971 and 1972. It was a private school, and it had a tradition of all-night dance parties with psychedelics till the sunrise. And so I was exposed. It also had a tradition of supporting people doing deep psychedelic work with a lot of high doses, not microdosing, but a lot of high doses. So I grew at an early age really to appreciate both the healing potential, the spiritual potential of going deep inwards in a kind of controlled therapeutic setting. We actually started experimenting with flotation tanks and isolation environments, but also the healing potential of community and celebrations and dances. So MAPS has always been about two different things. One is trying to move research in clinical settings, but the other is drug policy reform. These drugs should not be illegal. It's a fundamental violation of our human rights to block our exploration of our own consciousness. And so it's sometimes hard for people to understand. How is it that you can say that people in a clinical setting should be highly screened, worked with highly trained therapists, should be covered by insurance, ideally government insurance, and at the same time you're saying that anybody should be able to buy it and do it on their own, without the screening, without necessarily the support. I just think that the drug war is so fundamentally counterproductive that we should change that, and that we should educate people eventually in schools with honest drug education and with peer support. I think that peer support, we heard before from Odette about trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. And I think that we need mass mental health. We need a spiritualized humanity. We need people to be able to understand the role of psychedelics and support each other. And that can be done with peer support. The most important thing in psychotherapy outcome research that's been conducted over the last 30, 40 years has been that it's not the kind of psychotherapy that matters the most. It's the therapeutic alliance. It's the trust and safety between the patient and the therapist. And you can have that with friends. Now, when things get difficult and people are expressing very painful emotions or it's coming in their body, you'll hear from Bessel talk about the body keeps the score. I'll just give you one quick example of that, of how you do need to educate people. I was sitting with a German physician, this is quite a while ago, and his arm became paralyzed. He was doing MDMA, and his arm became paralyzed. And he was like, this is terrible. We got to go to the emergency room right away. And the emergency room was a long way away. We were camping out on a beach, and he's like, we got to go to the emergency room. And I'm like, MDMA does not hurt your nerves. There's something psychological about what's going on here, and so let's just sit with it and see what happens. And he calmed down enough to say, okay. And so over the next couple hours, the story came out that he had been at the deathbed of his father. His mother had been there, his siblings were there. The father was brain dead and was just kept alive by machines. And they had to decide whether to end the life support. And he was the one that wrote the order to end the life support. But he said the real problem was that he hated his father. And so the conflict was, did he kill his father? Did he do this out of hatred, or did he do this out of love, out of compassion? And he couldn't really address that question initially. It was so terrible, this idea that maybe he killed his father because he hated him. But that was underground. And as he explored this over time, he started talking about how his mother thought it was the right idea, his siblings thought it was the right idea. He did sort of sign the order to kill his father, but he didn't do it out of hatred. And as he sorted all this out over hours, the feeling came back to his arm. And then he was totally fine. So it's difficult for therapists can be trained about how this happens, and I think we can train large populations as well about this. So I do think that one day, I believe that we will have come to our senses as far as drug policy, and we'll have a psychedelic literate community. But it's going to take a while, and the route to bring that forward is through medicine and through science. Here's another story. This was my first date with my wife back in 1989. She didn't even think it was a date. I thought it was a date. And we had a great talk about her mushroom experience she had in college. And this was in graduate school. And it was a wonderful lunch. And then at the end, she says, I just want to tell you that I would never want to have a real relationship with anybody like you. And I'm like, what's wrong with me? And she said, well, you've done so much LSD, your chromosomes must be all screwed up. And I'm like, we were in Harvard, the Kennedy School of Government, and I was like, a smart woman like you believes this stuff? How could you possibly believe that? But there is so much fear and misinformation about what's about drugs, and about their risks and their dangers and their benefits. So I think we've got a long way to go in our culture. I also want to just talk about here the healing war-related trauma. Really, the methods that we've developed are for healing trauma, whether it's from war-related trauma, sexual trauma, accidents, natural disasters, anything. It's basically the same kind of therapeutic approach. But we'll focus a lot today on healing war-related trauma. I'd also like to thank Karen Sarfati for all the work that she's done to, she's heard this before, but we have kind of a joke that I'm the Karen Sarfati of America. And also I want to say that if you do have questions during the talk, feel free to interrupt at any time. We'll have time for questions afterwards, but really feel free to interrupt at any time. Just raise your hand, and because I think if you have questions, better to ask them instead of wait till the end, and other people might have the same kind of questions. So I started MAPS in 1986. It was really in 1972 that I decided to focus my life on psychedelics. It was out of despair of the Holocaust. I feel like I won the generational lottery that I was born in 1953. My grandfather left Poland in 1920 and came as a refugee to America. We had a training program in Poland, and we had, it was just about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, and we trained 25 Polish therapists, 15 Ukrainian therapists, 4 Palestinian therapists, and others from America and Europe, and I went to the village that my grandfather had come from. So I'm the first one in 105 years in my family to go back to this village. Szczucin was the name of it. It's near Białystok. It was about 6,000 people, and about half of them were Jewish people, and they were really woven into the culture. And then there was a war between Russia and Poland in 1920, and my grandfather escaped at that time. But when I was there, there's not a single Jew left living, not surprising, but there's nothing even to show that Jews were there practically. It was an 87-year-old man who leads tours of the Jewish history of this town, and the tours are about what's not there. Here used to be a synagogue. Here used to be another synagogue. Here was a cemetery, but all the gravestones and the headstones have been stolen for paving roads and different things like that. So it was really, on the other part of my family came over to America from Russia in 1880, and moved to Chicago, and they were the classic rags to riches, in that they actually had a rags business, and they built it up into a paper company. And my great-great-grandmother decided to leave Chicago in 1904 and come to Palestine in order to die and be buried on the Mount of Olives. So she's been there since 1907 in the Mount of Olives, and I've visited her grave there. So I've had Israeli relatives since then, and I've just was raised on stories of the Holocaust. And then a few years later was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I thought the US and Russia could blow up the world. And then it was my own country with Vietnam. And I'd studied Gandhi, I'd studied Tolstoy, I'd studied nonviolent resistance. And so I decided that the way that I would serve my country would be to not register for the draft, make them arrest me, go to jail, and cost them money. So that's how I was going to serve my country, by going to jail. And my parents said, well, if you do that, you're not, my dad was a doctor. He says, you're not going to be a doctor, you're not going to be a lawyer, you're not going to be anything that requires a license, because you'll be a felon. And I felt like, okay, I'll just have to pay that price, and I'll figure out something else to do. One of the other big things that really impacted me a lot was my bar mitzvah, because nothing happened. I thought it was a rite of passage, and I would become a man, and God would come. I mean, you're 13. I just thought God would come, and somehow I would be different. And I woke up in the next morning after my bar mitzvah. We had a nice party. I got some nice checks. But I was the same. I was not any more mature, any more grounded, nothing. And so I just said, God must be busy. A lot of people got bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. Tomorrow morning it'll happen. So I wait, and a whole week goes by, nothing happened, and then I realized that all these new people were getting bar and bat mitzvah, and if I was on a list, I'd now dropped off the list. And these rites of passage that I think have meant a lot in the past didn't really do much for me. But when I first started doing LSD, when I was 17 years old, I thought, this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. Who am I? Where do I fit in? What's my connection to spirituality? And so I had the delusion that many of us may have, that the more drugs you take, the faster you evolve. And so I was really good at that, but I just got more and more confused. I completely underestimated the whole idea of integration, that really it's not about the drugs you do, it's about what you bring back. It's about the integration. And so I was confused, and I went to the guidance counselor, and I had a great guidance counselor at this school, and to my utter shock, he gave me this book to read, Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research by Stan Grof. The book was not even published till 1975. This guy had it from Stan directly in 1972. So I read this book, and I thought, this is really tremendous. The research had been shut down in 1970, so Stan was getting ready to leave Johns Hopkins, but I thought, I don't have a lot of trust in religious stories, but I trust science. And yet here was science looking at spirituality. And so what really motivated me at this age of 18, after reading Stan's book and talking to Stan and meeting Stan in 1972, was this idea of this sense of unity, this sense of connection. All religions talk about that. And I felt this had important political connections. If we could feel connected to everything, and everything is connected to us, then it becomes harder to dehumanize others. It becomes harder to trash the environment. I thought it would lead to more compassion. And a lot of the hippies who are using psychedelics were anti-Vietnam War, helped start the environmental movement, the civil rights. They participated, they didn't start it, but helped with the civil rights movement, and then also the women's rights movement and others. So I thought that if we can bring psychedelics forward, that would really be a contribution to a more peaceful world. And I had identified, because I was expecting to be arrested, but I overestimated the efficiency of the government. And so they didn't even notice that I never registered. But I identified as a counterculture drug-using criminal. And my arc of my life has been to go from counterculture to culture, from criminal to legal, and I've found that psychedelics have played a major role in my life at every stage. So I'm continuing to be a medicine user or a spiritual user. And so I think there's this cultural moment where more and more we're realizing how much we are interconnected, and the problems that we have transcend borders, transcends religions, it's sort of global problems. So that's where I decided to devote my life to psychedelics when I was 18 years old. I was super lucky in that when I talked to my parents, I said, I want to drop out of college, I want to study psychedelics, and I want you guys to pay for it. And it shocked them a little bit. I'm the oldest of four, so I was the first one to go off to college, and in the middle of my freshman year, I'm flaming out and doing drugs. But eventually they said yes. So I had wonderful, wonderful parents, and so I feel like I've had the freedom and the support to deal with the pain and to deal with the things that we do to each other as humans. So I realized that I had to get grounded. That took me 10 years, dropped out of school, and then I went back to college. And in my first semester in 1982, I took a month-long workshop with Stan and Christina Groff at Esalen and learned about MDMA. And at the time, it was a code name Adam as a underground therapy drug. Even though it was legal, people didn't want to talk about it for fear that it would become illegal. But it also started becoming ecstasy. And so that was clear. This is during Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan, just say no, the escalation of the drug war. So it was clear that there was this, that it was doomed. The legal status of MDMA was doomed. But we had this opportunity to share MDMA with various different people. One of them, who you may have heard of, is Rabbi Zalman Schachter, the founder of the Jewish Renewal Movement. He compared MDMA to the Sabbath. And he was willing to talk about it in public. He was even willing to let me take MDMA in his shul on Yom Kippur. And I feel MDMA and atonement go together great. I only felt a little bit guilty because MDMA takes away your appetite, and you're supposed to be fasting. But 1986, I started MAPS. We sued the government. We won the case, but the DEA kept MDMA illegal. And I realized then that the only way forward is through the FDA and through science. And so that's where I started MAPS in '86 as a nonprofit psychedelic pharmaceutical company. I needed credibility. I needed to understand about how to move forward in the system. So I went to the Kennedy School of Government and figured out about how the FDA and the government regulates medicines, particularly psychedelics and cannabis. And then 28 years after I started MAPS, I realized that there was something that I had not known that pharma companies never really use, and that's called data exclusivity. MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912. It's in the public domain. The uses of MDMA for therapy were taking place before I even knew about MDMA, so they're in the public domain. So I always thought MDMA would become generic. But in 1984, Ronald Reagan passed a law to create incentives for developing drugs that are not patentable, and those are called data exclusivity. You have your own use of the data. It's different from a patent because another company could make their own data, so there could be competition, but there is a way then to make psychedelics into medicines, even though there's no patents, and then sell them for more than it costs to manufacture. And so I thought, okay, that would be the way that we could keep raising money for more research. So the vision was the nonprofit 100% owns a for-profit, but capitalism and pharma companies are not even the best way to do it because it's not about what's best for patients, it's about what's best for shareholders. So there's a modification of capitalism called the Public Benefit Corp. I'm not sure if there's that structure in Israel. There is? Good. Oh, okay, great. So it's but you can still give tax deductions, right? So the Public Benefit Corp, you don't give tax deductions. It's a for-profit company, but you don't have to maximize profits. You maximize public benefit. However, so anyway, that's where I started the nonprofit we started, the MAPS Public Benefit Corp, now known as Resilient. It has taken on investors because we weren't able to raise all the money we needed as quickly as we thought we needed. And so the values have now shifted, and that's where I said they really didn't deserve the MAPS name anymore because it wasn't about public benefit being first. But in any case, we started that in 2014. So I'm speaking to you as a president and founder of MAPS, not the pharma company. And what we're doing with the nonprofit is advancing research, changing policy, and evolving education. So this gets back to this idea that we want to make this available as a medicine covered by insurance, but we also want people to be able to access these experiences without it being a crime, with peer drugs and peer support and things like that. So 39 years so far. In April of next year, it'll be our 40th anniversary. I didn't really think it would take all this long to get this far, but it didn't really matter. That was the good thing for me, is that it looked sort of hopeless when I was starting. I just felt I had to do it. So I wasn't disappointed, I guess, or I wasn't discouraged, or maybe I just didn't give up, because when I started it, I really didn't think it would work anyway. So now we're moving forward. This I want to explain too is my great-grandparents left Chicago. My great-great-grandmother came here in 1904. My great-grandparents and my grandmother and her siblings moved to Palestine in 1923, and they built this house on Rothschild Boulevard, which is now a historical site, and it's owned by the Canadian HESEG Foundation, which is a foundation for lone soldiers. And they have a movie theater in the basement. So one of the most meaningful moments of my entire life was the people who have the HESEG Foundation there have kept in touch with the family. They tell the history of the building, so they've kept in touch with the family, with the Israeli relatives, and we come and visit. And so I asked them, could we use the basement movie theater to train therapists in Israel? Because we use videotapes of therapy sessions, and they said yes. So I got to be in the basement of my great-grandparents' house bringing MDMA to Israel. It was just incredible. And then the last conference that was organized here about a year ago, a movie crew were working on a documentary, and we wanted to go to this house. And we came to the house, and we asked them to let us in, and they let us in, but then everybody disappeared. So it's like me and this movie crew were in this house all by ourselves for well over an hour. We went up onto the roof, smoked a joint, started talking about it. So I just really have felt this pull to contribute to Israel my whole life. And it's taken a while to start research. The first big conference that we had was 1999 at the Dead Sea. We probably had 40 people there, something like this. But a lot of the policymakers, also researchers, Deborah Mash came from Ibogaine, and so this was just really an inspiring thing. Then we had another conference in 2005, and I started feeling like in the fairy tales, where if you're a prince and you want to marry the king's daughter, the king will say, oh, you just go kill this dragon, and if you kill this dragon, you can marry my daughter. So that was like, just get FDA approval, and then we'll start in Israel. So then we get FDA approval, and then they're not ready yet. Then they, on, and finally we started MDMA research at Harvard, where Timothy Leary had been, and finally the Ministry of Health here was ready to start psychedelic research. But we had to get permission from the Israeli Anti-Drug Authority, which no longer exists, but we managed to do that as well. So this was kind of a long, long process. And Trip of Compassion, which I imagine you all know of, there's a scene that's actually with the ambulance driver that's taken place in the basement of my great-grandparents' house. So this has, I think, been a big opportunity to change attitudes in Israel, but it's also still to this day the most patient-centered documentary ever made about what the process is of MDMA-assisted therapy. And then Karen in 2021 founded MAPS Israel, and that's led to an enormous amount of research. And I would say that I think, in some ways, the most important research with MDMA right now going on in the world will be the study comparing individual therapy with group therapy, because that's the key to reducing the cost, to scaling, but is group therapy as effective as individual therapy. We don't really know. I think individual therapy goes deeper, but I do think that the group and the group support and the group integration process might make up for that. And so group therapy might be as good as individual therapy at a fraction of the cost. And I think this is really the key to scaling. This is the MAPS logo as interpreted by the psychedelic artist Alex Gray. And what we're trying to communicate with this logo is that the hands are the foreground and the psychedelic imagery is the background. And what that means is that it's therapy more than the drug. It's not just here's a drug. What really matters is the human connection, the therapeutic connection, the trust, the therapeutic alliance, and that's what we're trying to communicate by this image. Now, this is the Zendo project. It's sort of forerunner, you could say, of SafeHeart, of the work at the Good People, the various work at raves all throughout Israel, all throughout the world. We started in 2003 at Burning Man. And so the Zendo project is psychedelic harm reduction. So what we're trying to demonstrate is that where you have a culture where psychedelics are widespread, like at the Nova Rave and elsewhere, there will be people that have a lot of problems with psychedelics. But what do you do about that? So we bring therapists that are trained in psychedelics and train others, and we have hundreds of volunteers that help people with difficult trips. And so we want to create a sense in the wider culture that you can have these opportunities for people to do psychedelics, to dance and celebrate. It's not explicitly a therapeutic setting, but that when people have difficult experiences that they don't know what to deal with, they can go for help. And so the Zendo project has been developed all over Burning Man. We've shared it around the world. I've seen work also at Midburn, where I was one time. And so this is a key part of what MAPS has done as well. The main idea is, and you'll see how this is very similar to psychedelic therapy. Trust, let go, be open. This is what Bill Richards, the oldest continuous operating psychedelic therapist who led the psilocybin work at Johns Hopkins. But the main things are, first off, create a safe space, help people feel safe. Then the second is sitting, not guiding. And what we mean by that is that we don't know the landscape, the inner landscape of the person that comes to us. You don't even know it if they're a therapist. You know, there's a lot going on there. And so we're not guiding them. We're trying to help them heal themselves. That's the essence of our method. We're trying to help people heal themselves. So we're sitting with them. We're offering some feedback. The other is talk through, not talk down. So that means is somebody has a difficult trip. You don't say, it'll pass, it'll be over, don't worry about it. You know, there's rainbows and butterflies, the world is good. You go into the problem, and that's the way through. You talk through, not talk down. And then this other part I think is really key, which is difficult is not the same as bad. And a lot of people think when something gets hard, then you got to run the other way. And actually you kind of have to open up to it. Now, this was Burning Man 2024. You know this is the Nova Rave exhibit. And so they had an incredible situation where starting at 6 a.m. they had a memorial for the people that had been murdered. And at 6:29 the dance party had started. Now, at this point, this was a little bit after the FDA had said no, had rejected MDMA. And I was feeling that the real reason that the FDA said no was not because of the criticisms. It was because we had traditional pharma people that were in charge of the pharma company that were trying traditional approaches for something innovative. And their attitude was, you don't talk to the media, you have a quiet period. And they succeeded in silencing themselves and silencing MAPS and me. And so we would have critics who I think would be unfair in many different ways, but that's the purpose. Science, the essence of science is criticism. You want criticism. You need to respond to it. And when you don't, you lose control of the narrative. And so I had been looking for new people to come in and buy the company. And in particular, I was looking at this fella, Antonio Gracias. He had donated $1 million to MAPS when we were raising the money to finish phase 3. He donated $16 million to Harvard, non-clinical stuff for psychedelics, to have the business school, the law school, the School of Public Health, the School of Government do various projects, collaborative on psychedelics. And he'd given us, donated $400,000 to have military people, special operators go through expanded access. And I wasn't able to meet up with him. I officiated a wedding for the first time in my life at Burning Man a few days, and he was at this, we went to the village where he was staying at. This was Kimball Musk and Christiana Musk and a bunch of them, and I was engaged in conversation. I couldn't really talk to Antonio, so I thought, okay, it's not gonna happen. There's too many people here at Burning Man. So I sort of gave up on that. So I went to the ceremony, and so at 6:29, the music began again, and there's thousands of people dancing, and who should be dancing right next to me but Antonio Gracias. So it was We Will Dance Again brought the new owners, basically, to take over the pharma company, because he approached me and he said, you know, it's not your fault, it's these traditional people's fault. I said, of course, I agree. And he said, we should just let them go bankrupt and let's buy the company back and do it in a public benefit way. And I said, well, they're not going to go bankrupt. They're going to find the resources. And so that's where we left it. But a couple months later, the company was so punitive in how they were trying to kick out the earlier investors that I reached to Antonio and said, we need a white knight to come take over the company. And after a month of discussions, he agreed to do that. We also then, I'd been in discussions with Sir Christopher Hahn, who is a British philanthropist, a hedge fund person, gives away around $500 million a year. And he'd been not quite ready to be involved, but after Antonio said he'd get involved, then Chris called me and said he wanted to get involved. We put him in touch with Antonio. So the two people now that run the company are both invested from their foundations, not from their funds. So they're not doing it primarily to make money, and they want MDMA generic in Africa and India, Ukraine, and much of the world. MAPS had raised about $150 million in donations and volunteer contributions, but we weren't able to raise all this money that we thought we needed. Now I think that was a mistake. We were told we needed $60 million for commercialization, and Big Pharma would have done it a year before, and that's where we started taking investors. So now it's a resilient pharmaceuticals. MAPS owns around 12 to 15% of it right now. And so this is Antonio Gracias and Sir Christopher Hahn. They've the fund, you know, they put in $50 million. They'll put in whatever more we need. So the message is that MDMA will become a medicine in the United States. We have all the money, or they have all the money that's needed. You know, somebody asked me in Dubai at the conference, imagine you got $1 billion, what would you do with it? And I said, I would buy back the company and really put public benefit first. Now, RFK Jr. Has said, he's the secretary of HHS, that he wants access to psychedelic therapies within 12 months, and he said this several months ago. His son had problems with addiction and was helped with psychedelics. His son, a different son, just invited me to an event in Washington called the, it's a summit meeting, and it's going to be people from the White House and people from HHS talking about Make America Healthy Again. I won't be able to go. I'll be giving a speech somewhere else that night, but somebody else from MAPS will go. But I spent also 2 hours at Burning Man with his son, who was helped with psychedelics and really got a real good understanding. So I think his interest is very sincere. The concern is that he has a reputation for not caring about science all that much. And the solution to that, and this is where I have problems, I'd say, with the current, with Resilient, the solution to the lack of trust in the regulatory agencies is transparency. All the data should be made public. All the communications with FDA should be made public. And that's what MAPS did before the traditional people took over. So I don't think that's going to happen. But there is very strong support. Marty McCarry is the commissioner of the FDA, and he said psychedelic research is a top priority. So there's what's going on for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. There are active negotiations with FDA, even though the government shutdown has taken place. They're still in discussions. There's a third-party review of the videotapes of all the therapy sessions to demonstrate that the data is reliable. We don't They're trying to see if therapists ever told patients, don't talk about your side effects because we're changing the world and you got to approve this drug, or exaggerate your benefits. So they'll see that none of that happened. What's likely to happen, I think, within the next 6 to 8 months is some possibility of some sort of limited approval with additional research being required. Now, I don't have direct negotiations with the FDA, I don't know, but this is just my guess, but I think it's very possible that this will happen. I think, unfortunately, from my perspective, we did phase 3 research in Israel, Canada, and the United States, and both the Ministry of Health in Israel and the Ministry of Health in Canada are all willing to go second, but they don't want to go first. And so they're all looking for the FDA to go first. So I think that once FDA makes some moves, then there's a good chance the Ministry of Health here will follow suit in some ways. So the future looks potentially bright. Sun's coming out from around the clouds. How does MDMA work for PTSD? Now, when you have PTSD, and this is, again, not from war-related trauma only, but any kind of trauma, that your amygdala, your fear processing part of the brain, is hyperactive. Your prefrontal cortex, where we think logically, so people with PTSD are easily triggered. They'll hear a sound and they don't take the time to say, is this a car backfiring? Is this a bomb? Is this, so that you're not as logical, you're easily frightened. And the hippocampus, where we put memories into long-term storage, has diminished activity. So these traumatic memories are always seeming like they're about to happen or are happening. You're never really processing the trauma to put it in the past, to turn it from the foreground to the background. So PTSD changes your brain. MDMA does almost the exact opposite. It reduces activity in the amygdala so that fear-based memories are not so salient. You can approach, I'll just say, since I'm telling Burning Man stories, this mother and her son came to me at Burning Man with a video, and they said that their son had, since he was little, he was now 21, had been scared of spiders. And now he was 21, and he and his friends had taken MDMA to have a picnic. And at this picnic, he saw a little spider. And he was like, why am I scared of the spider? The spider is a fraction of the size of me. I don't need to be scared of the spider. So his fear didn't launch. He was more logical. And he said, to prove that I'm no longer scared of spiders, while he's high on MDMA, he went to a pet store and asked them to take out a tarantula, which are these big, hairy, frightening-looking spiders. And the video was this tarantula crawling all over his arm, by his neck, down his other arm. And so it just was this really fast reprocessing, you could say, of this fear-based response to spiders. And it's because of the physiological things that MDMA can do in your brain. It's also the release of oxytocin, other hormone, other neurotransmitters. So it's bonding, it's connection. It's almost like MDMA was made for treating trauma. You probably, or you may have heard of the octopus study by Doblin. I'm proud to say that we provided the MDMA for these octopuses. Octopuses and humans went different ways around 600 million years ago, but octopuses still process serotonin. And so and they're solitary creatures. There was my octopus teacher, if you may have seen that documentary. They stay away from other octopuses, they'll kill other octopuses, but near the end of their life, mating season, they look for their mate, they mate, and then they die. But turns out you give MDMA to an octopus, now it wants to hang out with other octopuses. Unfortunately, she said the cameras broke when they were trying to film the octopuses hanging out with other octopuses. But this demonstrates that it's pre-verbal, pro-social, and evolutionarily conserved. And I'm sort of making a logical leap, but one of the things I think that's really important is to treat people closer to the trauma, not to wait. So I think when we talk about children that are traumatized, particularly refugees and migrants, when families are traumatized together, I think one day we'll do group therapy with families helping each other. And I think that even though kids are not as verbal about expressing what's going on in them, I think this pro-social fear reduction effect will really take place. This is, in a way, an even more important paper that Gould did with mice. And what she showed is that MDMA will release oxytocin, and then the oxytocin contributes to neuroplasticity, to the creation of new neural patterns, of new synaptic connections. And she calls this opening up a critical period. That we all know that little kids can learn languages better than adults. There's critical periods for vision, for all of our different senses, and this reopening of this ability, this neuroplasticity, is what means you can take a profound experience with the psychedelics, and with the proper integration, you can take advantage of this critical period, take advantage of the neuroplasticity, and make it so that you can take short-term insights into long-term change. The classic psychedelics reduce activity in the default mode network. This is what Lior Roseman worked on a lot. You may have seen a picture of psilocybin where your brain's connections, there's a few connections, and then under psilocybin there's way more connections. So Lior worked on that. But the default mode network is basically our sense of self. And for those of you that know about Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, this idea is we're scanning the world always for what matters to us in our individual ego-centered sense from birth to death, and you're scanning the world like that. And his original version of the hierarchy of needs from Maslow was self-actualization. That it's your security need, your food survival needs, security needs, belonging needs, self-esteem ends up with self-actualization. What people don't know much, in the last few years of his life, Maslow changed it in his, as he met Stan Grof, started looking at the results of psychedelic research, and so the sort of highest part now of is above self-actualization is self-transcendence, is to realize that we're a part of something much bigger, and that gives you a spiritual connection, that gives you purpose and meaning. It's not just about yourself. And so this reduction of activity in the default mode network is what can really help with seeing the world from a broader perspective. And pretty much all the classic psychedelics do this. So then what Gould did is a bunch of animal studies, and this is the time course of the acute subjective effects in humans of the different psychedelics. You can see ketamine is shorter, psilocybin and MDMA are a bit longer, LSD longer, and ibogaine is the longest. And then in these animal studies, she looked at the critical period open state in mice. And what she showed is that the longer that you're in the psychedelic state, the longer this critical period will last. With ibogaine, it can be months. So again, this just points to the critical importance of the integration work without drugs after you make these sort of breakthroughs with the psychedelic therapy. We did a study, veterans, firefighters, and police officers. This was our first one really focusing on war-related trauma. I like to say that we don't really do science, we do political science, meaning that we chose MDMA for political reasons, we chose PTSD for political reasons. So in this particular project, we wanted to focus on veterans. We thought we might get firefighters, but we never thought we would get police officers. But we were just trying to send a signal that those people that are enforcing the drug laws have terrible traumatic lives in some ways. They see the worst of humanity, and we were saying this is for them as well. And in the end, we did have 2 police officers volunteer, which is great. So what did we learn in phase 2? We learned that the cause of PTSD is irrelevant to the treatment. And that was good because we could enroll PTSD from any cause in phase 3. We also learned, and this has been a big issue, is that the lower doses of MDMA made people uncomfortable. So it's like turbulence in an airplane. When you're just taking off, it kind of, a lot of turbulence, but when you get higher, it's sort of smooth sailing. So the whole point from, I did my PhD in 2001, and I decided that I looked a lot at the double-blind problem. How do you do research with psychedelics that are, that you've got them? How do you do double-blind design? And the solution that I had was therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. And that would be the same with any other psychedelic. And the challenge was to find which dose so microdose doesn't work because you wouldn't confuse it with a full dose. And bigger doses are not so good because they're so therapeutic that you might not be able to tell a difference between the 2 groups. So how do you find the right dose? So we spent 16 years in phase 2 studies, and we looked at therapy with no MDMA, therapy with 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40, 50, 75, 100, 125, and 150. And we would then, to prolong the experience, we'd give half that amount after 2 hours or so. what we discovered, to our surprise, was that these lower doses did help with blinding, but they made people uncomfortable. And then in the previous study with veterans, firefighters, and police officers, we had one group got 30 milligram, one got 75 milligrams, and one group got 125. And the group that got the 75 milligrams did the best. Now, when you randomize, it doesn't mean it's all equal. So the 125 group had more associated depression than the 75 milligram dose group, but it told us that the 75 milligram dose group was very effective. And so we didn't find this sweet spot of where the dose was not compromising the therapy or turning over and helping the therapy. We also learned that all the doses were well tolerated. We had a medium to large effect size. So when we tried to negotiate with FDA about phase 3, we said to them, we will give you blinding if you want, but you're going to make our job easier rather than harder. And the real question we need to answer is, can you do this for therapy? If you can do it with therapy, why bother adding a drug? So we should be testing MDMA-assisted therapy against therapy at its strongest, which was without low doses of MDMA. And the FDA agreed with that. And then to our dismay, those people at the FDA left the FDA, and new, more conservative people came in. So here's a question that people have asked about working with war-related trauma, which is, when you work with people that are, it's not really post. If you are involved, like in Ukraine or here in Israel, you know, the trauma is not really in the past. So is it unethical to work with people when they're still being traumatized? You make them more open, you make them more sensitive. And so the image I have here is this military hospital. And so my view is that when somebody is hurt in a war or for any reason, we don't think twice about patching them up, even if they go back into the war. You don't think, oh, we shouldn't patch them up because now they're going to be more vulnerable again. So I think it makes sense to me to treat people even if they're still in a traumatic situation. They're more likely to relapse, they're more likely to have associated problems from still being traumatized, but I think it is ethical to treat people even if they're still in a traumatic situation. Now, we've built bipartisan support. That was one of the key reasons we worked with veterans. So Dan Crenshaw, former Navy SEAL, said psychedelics don't change the personality of veterans. It's just like they've had a reset. So I think I think when I first focused my life on psychedelics back in '72, I made a fundamental mistake in a way, is that I underestimated the power of culture. I thought psychedelics, hippies, all this peace and love, that psychedelics will make people more loving, more connected. And I think in general that's true, but I think that had as much or more to do with the cultural context than with the drug itself. And one of the best examples, I would say, of my misunderstanding was the União de Vegetal, which is a group that practices ayahuasca in Brazil. They're the first group that went to the US Supreme Court that got approval to do ayahuasca in the United States in a legal way. But some of the leaders of the UDV supported Bolsonaro. And what Bolsonaro was doing is destroying the Amazon, where their culture, where their where their sacrament came from. So I think churches in general, religions often associate with power. They're not always as spiritual as you would hope that they would be. The fundamentalists of all the religions are more like each other than they are like sort of the more open-minded people of each religion. So I think now people realize, at least Dan Crenshaw, that we're not going to turn every veteran into a peacenik just by giving them MDMA. He and I have gotten to know each other, and he's invited me to speak to his constituents a couple times, so that's really good. Now, this is a project here in Israel. Moral injury is a real big issue, particularly, I would say, for American soldiers who went to Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, if you're a woman in Afghanistan, it's worse now than before. Iraq is not better off. So when you are being led by politicians to do things that end up killing a lot of your friends and people getting wounded, and you're doing things that don't seem to really match with your moral sense, this adds a complexity to treating people with PTSD when they have moral injury. Now, the therapeutic method that we've developed began with Stan Grof, I wouldn't say began with Stan Grof, but he really worked with LSD psychotherapy. And it's the model of the unconscious. It's the same sense of trusting the process, the inner healing, intelligence. We all know our body heals itself below our conscious level of awareness. And so the theory is that the unconscious has a similar healing mechanism that makes it so that when we give people a psychedelic, as I said, we're not the guide. We support whatever's emerging. That's this belief in this inner healing intelligence. I would say, though, also, before I get into this, that the first work of any psychedelic for treating PTSD began in 1961. And it began in the Netherlands, and it was Dr. Bastiaans, and he worked with LSD for concentration camp syndrome. And a lot of the Dutch leaders had been in the camps as well. They'd been in resistance fighters. So Bastiaans was the last person in the world, up until the 80s, that he still had permission to work with LSD. But it was LSD for concentration camp syndrome. And there's a book called Shaviti by Katsetnik about him going to the Netherlands, and it's describing his LSD experiences. So I think that's an incredible book to take a look at, Shaviti. Yeah, Why Am I Crying? Is that or a different? Oh, there's a newer one. Yeah, is that available now? Is it? Okay, yeah, well, so that's the origins of psychedelics for PTSD, from working with people in the concentration camps. So our therapy is this idea of the alliance between the therapist and the patients. The direction is sourced from the participant's experience, and we believe that each person has this intrinsic and natural ability to heal. And there's a treatment manual that we have on the website. It's available for free. This is a video that I won't show because I'm running out of time, but this was a video of a veteran with PTSD. And you could have seen, maybe some other time, I can provide the link if somebody wanted to see it. So we're training therapists all over the world. The way we train therapists is that there's basically three parts. The first part is this 6-day in-person, sometimes occasionally we'll do it online. We're about to do it online in a few days for the Department of Defense, where they've gotten $10 million from Congress to do MDMA-assisted therapy in active duty soldiers. And so there's one study at Strong Star in Texas and Barbara Rothbaum in Atlanta, and they're combining MDMA with prolonged exposure. And we offered them training in our method, but they didn't want to do it in person. They only wanted to do it online, so we'll do that. But basically, it's this initial training. What's the treatment manual? What's the adherence criteria? How do you approach this? Watching videotapes, role plays, things like that. Then we believe that it's really important for therapists to get trained by having the drug that they give to their patients for them to know. Now, that's not controversial when you think about any other kind of psychotherapy. Psychotherapists learn a method, you learn cognitive behavioral therapy, and you work on yourself like that. When there's no drug involved, nobody has to give you permission. So it's not controversial, but we can only do this in a legal context with protocols. And then the third part, and we will never make this required. This should always be optional. You can be a good therapist who has never done MDMA and still get good results from your patients. The same is true of the other psychedelics. I just think that you would be better if you knew what the drug was. And in the 8-hour MDMA session, people are listening to music, their eye shades on, about half the time they're internal. They're not even talking to the therapist. And if you don't know what's going on as a therapist, you might be saying, nothing's going on, tell me what's going on. You could interfere with this process. And you then become much more attuned to body language, to what they're doing. So I really believe that's important. And then the third part is clinical supervision. So we videotape all the sessions. As people work with their first PTSD patient, they end up getting supervision from adherence raters and supervisors on the technique. Once they've learned the technique, then they are free to do whatever they want. We're not trying to say therapists have to do one method. We just want them to know the method that was used in the phase 3 studies, and then you can combine MDMA. MDMA is a tool, and there are projects. The other project that the Department of Defense is doing with active duty soldiers is MDMA with ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. We've done work with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. This is just where we've done these trainings, just had that one in Poland. This is Karen Anito in Sarajevo, where we had a bunch of Ukrainians, a few Palestinians, mostly people from around the world. It was really, really exciting. This was the training in Poland, all the happy people afterwards. This was really shocking to me, where we went to visit some of the graveyards in Ukraine. And if you can see something I'd never seen before, they have the photos of the people that are buried there above the grave. So you see this whole sea of people that have died fighting the Russians, trying to preserve freedom. It was really emotionally moving. And we've got one coming up in Switzerland, Mexico. We are trying to do one in Lebanon. We have a donor who's given us $800,000 to train Lebanese therapists and to start pilot studies, first in individual and then in group. I think that group therapy is more complicated than individual therapy. So we want people to know individual therapy first before they work with a group. And I believe it's really, really important to bring healing to all sides of all different conflicts. So we are also trying to work with Palestinian therapists as well. But this is what I've just said. This was Aaron Wolfgang. This is the one combining MDMA with acceptance and commitment therapy. This is combining MDMA with prolonged exposure. And we will give this training online. This is the first study ever done with group therapy. And so this was groups of 6, 4 therapists, and this began individual therapy and then one session individual therapy and then one group. And after people had been through, the first 2 cohorts had been through it, they felt that they needed one more MDMA session, and they decided to do that as a group. So it's an individual session first and then 2 group sessions. Their 4th cohort was actually transgender people from the military, who are highly traumatized in a lot of ways. This is a project here in Israel. This is slightly different design, 2 individual sessions and then a group session. And the one that Karen is going to be doing, MAPS Israel, is either individual sessions only or group sessions only, and adding a little bit more of individual integration. This is the design, but she's talked about it. This is what I'm thinking about now. So the idea had been for me for all these years to try to make MDMA into medicine, open the door to all different psychedelics. Even though I talk about MDMA, really what we want is therapists to be cross-trained with all the different drugs. Psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, ketamine. Pharma companies want you to buy their drug, and the FDA wants only one variable at a time. But the goal is to have therapists cross-trained in all the different psychedelics, and then they customize the treatment to each individual patient. There could be sequences where you combine things, or you do MDMA first and then psilocybin, or all different ways. But I needed a new vision, because it does seem like we're moving now, the psychedelic renaissance is moving forward. So I needed a new multi-generational vision, and this is a world of net zero trauma by 2070. And what we mean by that is that not that there's no trauma, just through epigenetics and multi-generational trauma and global climate change and authoritarianism and hatred, it seems like the burden of trauma on humanity as a whole is going to increase over the while. So we just want to get to a point where we're not increasing both trauma you experience and multi-generational trauma that you inherit. And Rachel Yehuda, who's an incredible researcher, comes to Israel a lot. She's at Mount Sinai and the Bronx VA, has done work with the epigenetics of trauma and helped identify how trauma is passed from parents to children. And she's got preliminary evidence that if you do successful therapy, that the epigenetic markers will change. You do not need to keep passing on trauma. And I was just in Brazil recently, and I met this woman whose relatives, aunt and uncle, specialize in doing MDMA couples therapy with couples before they conceive a child, to try to work through their own traumas to change their epigenetic markers so that then they're not transmitting multi-generational trauma. This is the project that we're trying to start in East Jerusalem with Palestinian therapists, with Palestinian patients. We're having a bit of a problem with the Israeli Ministry of Health not giving the import permit. And so the hospital is a little bit uncertain if they want to fight back. They're not sure what kind of retribution they might get. And so I'll be meeting with the psychiatrist there on Sunday. Hopefully, Karen, you can come. But also in Lebanon. So we do have projects here. It's a Lebanese that left during the Civil War, and made a fortune in the U.S. and wants to pay back to Lebanon. So I was scared to go to Lebanon. I just think Hezbollah, I have Israeli relatives right now that are in Lebanon with the IDF. And so I feel like, they're bringing guns and bullets, and I'm trying to bring MDMA. And so we're working with the Lebanese Ministry of Health, the guy in charge of mental health, used to work for the WHO. And so we'll start. And from what I just was in Abu Dhabi also, they're interested. But the same way, the people in the Arab world are sort of thinking who's going to go first, and they're all been pointing to Lebanon. And our idea this prioritizing global communities with the largest burden of trauma and the fewest resources. The first project we have is in Africa, in Somaliland. And we've imported MDMA there already, and it was for the training of therapists. And that was tremendously helpful, and now they're going to start to work with patients. And this is my last slide, and then we'll have a little bit of time if we have for questions. But this is coming out on Netflix in a few days in Waves and War. And it's about ibogaine for the treatment of traumatic brain injury, addiction, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a very powerful documentary, and it really highlights the potential of ibogaine-assisted therapy to help people. We started out, and when Boaz and I were first in communications about ibogaine, ibogaine has this unique property of helping people go through withdrawal from opiates and fentanyl. No other psychedelic does that we know. So that was what it was focused on, but now we're seeing ibogaine for PTSD, depression, other kinds of addictions as well. So that's the hope is that we will be able to usher in over the next 5 years or so approval for MDMA, psilocybin, 5-MeO-DMT. Ketamine will be now more and more used, not just Spravato, but generic cheap ketamine, IV or IM. And so I think we have a great opportunity to bring the healing of psychedelics at a time of great cultural and global need. So thank you. So I don't know if we have time for questions, but if anybody has, great.
So we're working at SafeHeart with people that experience trauma under the use of psychedelics.
Yeah.
And that's a new thing. So from your knowledge over the years, I assume you've met people who you worked with psychedelic therapy, which are more experienced with psychedelic, and others that are less experienced with psychedelics.
Yeah.
What do you think that can happen treating with psychedelics? People who have the trauma were on the use of the same substance that you're using at the time of the therapy?
Well, I do think that when you are on psychedelics, things are imprinted at a deeper level than normal. And so that was the question, right, that I asked you about this state-dependent learning. So I'll just say that there was someone that I knew, he was studying to be a therapist, actually, but he had had a terrible experience with LSD when he was young. And he thought that he now he was 60, but this was when he was around 19. And it had bothered him ever since. He thought that he had spoken to God. God told him that you are imperfect, and the best way you can honor me is to kill yourself. And he actually did. He tried to commit suicide while he was under the influence of LSD. And he was never really able to get over it in all of his therapy. And so I was thinking, should we do LSD? I said, maybe let's just do MDMA. And he was able to recall the moments where he was having this interaction with what he thought was God and his decision to commit suicide and work through that. And then what he shared with us that he had not shared before, ever, is that the way he tried to commit suicide, he thought was to run his car into somebody else's car. So it's both suicide and murder, in a way. And he veered off at the last minute and didn't do it. But it was under the influence of MDMA that he was able to deal with his prior trauma that came to him under LSD. And I think that if we had done LSD or psilocybin, it could have also helped him. So I think that working with, we've done a lot of work. 60% of the people in our studies have never done psychedelic or never done MDMA before. 40% had done MDMA before. That was one of the criticisms that the FDA, the critics and others had, that the 40% of the people that had done MDMA before they must have volunteered because they liked MDMA. And therefore, they would have fewer side effects and they would have better outcomes. So I think this is where critics are good. You need to raise these kind of questions. But when you looked at the data, the 60% who'd never done MDMA before didn't respond any differently on either safety or efficacy than the 40% who had. So I think that when you experience trauma under the influence of a psychedelic, chances are it's going to be imprinted at a very, very deep level. And you may need to use psychedelics. I don't think that all of them would need to do that. You can get healed in other ways. But I wouldn't be scared of using psychedelics in people that were traumatized. I would just think that you need a very safe container for them and a lot of focus on the preparation and integration. But you'll be the ones that really will tell us what you learn. Yeah. Yes?
So for me, it's more, okay, Rita,
Ah.
and I'm a Nova survivor.
Oh.
So I wasn't on psychedelics during the attack.
Were you in the study?
Yes.
Okay.
I was in the study, I was on weed and a little bit of alcohol. It all wore off very quickly in the morning. But the question is about therapists, really, because as part of the community and seeing why a lot of people don't go to therapy because they feel like the therapist will never get them.
Yeah.
Leave 1 second psychedelics. Just the use of it, the idea that it's bad. If you
Yeah.
were in it, you
Yeah.
lunatic and never went to a music festival. And so that idea of therapists using or trying the treatment
Mm.
is big. But how do you really get, like, eventually you have people with PTSD or the trauma they got from such a various, world, from rape, from a party, from parents that were abusive, whatever, right? From the army.
Yeah.
How do you get to know what will be the right treatment? I know you said it doesn't matter where you got
The trauma, yeah.
the trauma, but then the dealing with this, it is different. So
Yeah.
how do you get therapists to know what will be the right thing? Is it psilocybin or is it MDMA?
Well,
or is
I think that there are actually different lessons you get from MDMA than you do get from the classic psychedelics. So the default mode network weakening doesn't happen as much with MDMA. I actually think that the kind of treatment that people would get the most benefit from would be sometimes with MDMA and sometimes with psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca, that you would go through a sequence of psychedelics and they would call out different things. In terms of this idea of therapists not really understanding the patients, I will say that we've treated about 400 people. And what we've learned is that there has never been a case where at some point in the therapy, the patient hasn't asked the therapist, have you done this drug too? The patients always want to know, do you understand me? So I think there will be some therapists that think, yeah, if you're just hedonistic and going to parties and all that's bad. But I think that what therapists really want is to help their patients. They really want to see the outcomes. So more and more, as people are starting to see the outcomes of working with psychedelics, I think the resistance of other therapists will go down. But I think people are waiting for FDA or regulatory agencies to say yes. But it's always the fit between the therapist and the patient, and there's a lot of times where it's not a good fit. But I also think, as I said, that it would never be mandatory, and I think you could be a sensitive, good therapist who've never done drugs. We get psychiatrists that tell us, I give electroshock to my patients, and I don't need to take electroshock. Or I give antipsychotics to my patients, and I don't need to take antipsychotics. And I say, you're totally right, but in those cases, the electroshock is the treatment, the antipsychotics are the treatment, but in psychedelic-assisted therapy, the therapist is part of the treatment, and that's what makes the fundamental difference. Yeah.
One last question.
Okay, one last question. Make it a hard one. Anybody have a question? No? Okay.
when will it be available?
Oh, what?
When will the treatment will be available? We're all eager here in Israel to start the treatment.
Yeah. The good thing is that Sir Christopher Hahn, as I said, who's invested, wants MDMA to be generic in many places outside of the U.S. So I think, unfortunately, I think that the Israeli Ministry of Health is not willing to go first, although they could make an independent decision separate from FDA.
Said that we have to treat it right away. That's how it works. To get treatment right away, get therapy right away, not wait.
Well, yeah, let me just add this one last thing, which is this idea of treating people closer to the trauma. So Christiana Musk, who is married to Kimball, who's Elon Musk's brother. When she was young, she tried to kill herself, and she's spoken about this in public. And she was at McLean Hospital, connected to Harvard, for a year and a half, inpatient. And so for the last 5 years, I have been trying to start a project at McLean where it would be in the same ward that she was in. And so we finally succeeded in that. So she's helping fund a study with 18 to 22-year-olds with PTSD. There's another, Sabrina Gracias, who is Antonio's ex-wife, is funding a project with Charlie Grobe and others at UCLA, also in 18 to 22-year-olds. The FDA will not permit us to go below 18. But once they approve it, then they're requiring studies in adolescents. And then you get incentivized where you get 6 more months of data exclusivity. So I think the idea of treating people closer, and I would say that right on October 7th, when I heard it was going on, I contacted Karen and I said, we should try to get the Ministry of Health to get permission to flood these people with MDMA therapy and to do therapy with a large number of people and see if that is something protective from them developing PTSD later. And the government was so in disarray, there was no way for us to get permission for that, and that's what it ended up, treating people who had been traumatized, but after, and it still hasn't even started now, it's 2 years later. But I do believe that in the future, let's say somebody attempts suicide, they go to the emergency room or something, right now you can give them ketamine, and you can give ketamine on top of all the other drugs. One of the complications with MDMA, not so much with psilocybin or other things, is that we want people to withdraw from all their psychiatric medications, that the psychiatric medications diminish the effect of MDMA. So I think that treating people as soon as they're traumatized is really, shortly thereafter, would be a very good idea. But I think it'll take another year or so, maybe, for the Ministry of Health to make it more widely available, maybe. I guess, is there one more or no? Okay, sorry. We'll talk afterwards. Yeah. Okay. All right.